Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of With the British Army in the Holy Land by H. O. Locke. Chapter 4, Palestine.
The story of a campaign is more interesting if we have a general idea of the topography of the country in which it is conducted. Our time will therefore not be wasted if we leave the British Army on the frontiers of the Holy Land for a few minutes longer and form a mental picture of the terrain over which they are about to operate. Picture a country, about the size of Wales, divided into parallel strips running north and south, zones of alternate elevation and depression. This will give a rough idea of the conformation of southern Palestine. On the west is the Mediterranean Sea. Skirting the sea are a series of sand dunes, beyond which comes the coastal plain. Together, these form the first depressed strip, averaging about 15 miles in width. Northwards, it tapers to a point where the mountains reach the sea at Cape Carmel. Beyond the coastal plain is the range of mountains on which stands Jerusalem. The mountains of Samaria and of Judea, rising to a height of about 3,000 feet above the level of the sea. On the eastern side of these mountains is a steep drop to the valley of the Jordan and the Dead Sea, the level of the latter being nearly 1,300 feet below the level of the Mediterranean, and more than 4,000 feet below the summit of the adjoining Mount of Olives. Beyond the Jordan Valley, the country rises again abruptly into the hills of Moab, or eastern Palestine. Beyond lies the waterless desert. Before entering into details, let us imagine ourselves to be standing on one of the mountains round about Jerusalem. Away to the north, Mount Carmel rises abruptly from the sea. Thence the chain of Carmel runs south-southeast for some 20 miles, dividing the coastal plain from the plain of Esdraelon. About Dothan and Tul Keram, it merges in the range comprising the mountains of Samaria and Judea, which range runs north and south through the land like the backbone of a fish, with steep spurs, like ribs, thrown out on either side towards the coastal plain and the Jordan Valley. Westwards, we look down upon the cultivated plain, and across it to the golden belt of sand dunes, tapering like the waist of an hourglass where the olive plain touches the sea at Jaffa. Beyond lies the deep blue of the Mediterranean. Eastwards is a sheer abyss falling into the Jordan Valley, where that river, like a silver thread, winds its way along until it falls into the Dead Sea. Beyond, as if across a 15-mile moat, rise abruptly the mountains of Moab. The map of Palestine might be aptly compared to a bridge marker. The horizontal line is the plain of Esdraelon. In vertical columns, below the line, lie the strips of the country which we have just described. Above the line are the mountains of Lebanon, Tabor and Hermon, Galilee and the Sea of Tiberias, and the valleys and rivers of Damascus. Let us consider these zones in greater detail, more especially with regard to their influence on war. The sea, which skirts Palestine throughout its length, confers a twofold advantage upon her mistress. In the first place, it provides a supplementary line of communication. We have already seen that, during the advance across the desert, seaborne supplies from Port Said were landed at El Arish. This method was continued throughout our advance in Palestine, and landing places were improvised at various convenient stages. There is no good harbour along this coast, and landing, which has to be done by beach boats, is difficult, especially in a westerly wind. Nevertheless, considerable supplies were thus landed, chiefly of fuel and fodder, which would be little liable to damage by immersion. In the second place, help can be given during actual military operations by the Navy. Our ships frequently lay off the coast and bombarded the enemy's positions. Of necessity, each side had a flank resting on the sea. To the British, this was a feature of strength. To the Turk, it was one of weakness. He was compelled, therefore, at all times to draw back or refuse his coastal flank, while the British flank was constantly thrown forward, menacing the flank of the enemy. There is little to be said about the sand dunes, though. Being on the flank, they were often the scene of operations. The sand here is soft and the going bad. Recourse in these operations was therefore had to camel transport. To the field engineer, difficulties were presented much as in the desert. During the trench warfare before Gaza, when a raid was carried out on beach post, No attempt was made to cut the enemy wire with our artillery, but the wire was simply pulled up by hand with the standards, for which the soft sand had provided no firm foundations. The coastal plain comprises, towards the north, the biblical plain of Sharon, and towards the south, the land of Philistia. By this plain, and not through Judea, lies the road from the Nile to the Euphrates. Along this plain have marched the invading armies of all the ages. Though generally a flat country, the flatness is relieved by a few rolling hills, of no great height. It is very fertile and has a good supply of water contained in wells. It thus presents many advantages, and but few disadvantages, to an army operating in the field. Roads are good or are easily improvised, while such obstacles to an invader's advance do not exist here as in the hills. Our successes in the campaign under consideration were generally attained by first pushing forward along the plain and then turning right-handed into the hills. From the plain, the country rises, in places through the intermediate foothills of the Shephelah, in places more abruptly and directly into the mountains of Judea. These mountains are of limestone formation, terraced where possible for cultivation, and often wooded with olive trees or tilled as corn patches or vineyards. The scenery is rugged and pretty, the hillsides generally steep, sometimes precipitous. This is the Palestine of the picture books. Deep gorges have been cut out by water action, but as no rain falls throughout the summer months, these are, for the most part, but dry watercourses. There are a few good springs to be found in the valleys. The villages upon the hills are, however, mainly dependent upon cisterns constructed in the rock, in which they catch as much water as possible during the winter rains. These mountains formed the stronghold of the Israelites, who never maintained sway for any length of time over the lower surrounding country. The mountains abound in ruins and are rich in caves, such as may have been the caves of En-Gedi and Adullam. One of the caves witnessed a lurid scene in our mountain fighting. A party of the enemy had established themselves in a cave with machine guns. Gurkhas attacked, and the enemy, after inflicting casualties, thought to make good their escape by a back exit. But outside there were other Gurkhas lying in wait, and as the enemy emerged, they killed them all. We have seen that the general formation of this range of mountains is like the backbone of a fish. We should therefore expect to find communications from north to south easy enough along the spine or ridge, but difficult on either side, where there would be a succession of ribs or spurs to be crossed. This is the case. There is only one first-class road from north to south through this hill country, namely, that which runs along the ridge from Samaria through Nablus, Jerusalem, Bethlehem and Hebron to Beersheba. Communications from east to west are, however, more easy along the spurs and intervening valleys. To attempt an advance northwards from spur to spur is tedious work. After a comparatively short push, a pause is necessary to enable roads to be constructed for bringing forward guns and supplies. We had an illustration of this in March 1918, when a forward move of this character met at first with but moderate opposition. A pause of a few weeks was necessary to enable fresh roads to be made. In the meantime, the enemy had been heavily reinforced, and when the next advance was attempted, stout resistance was encountered. This hill country lent itself readily to defence. Mutually supporting heights could be held. A hill, when captured thus, became a focus for fire concentrated from all the hills around. So when the Turks attacked us in these hills, they met with much less success than in the Jordan Valley, and, on the other hand, they were able to offer a stouter resistance to our attacks in these hills than they could on the coastal plain. The Jordan Valley, as we have already seen, is more than 1,000 feet below the level of the Mediterranean, that is, below what we speak of as sea level. In this respect, it is unique in the geography of the world. In wintertime, the climate is equable. In summer, it is unbearable. In peacetime, even the Bedouin forsake it in summer. The district is pestilential to a degree, and in no sense of the word, a white man's country. It possesses a feature of considerable importance in the River Jordan itself, almost the only river in Palestine with a perennial flow. The river is tortuous and rapid, and not adapted to navigation. These features indicate this area as a difficult one in which to hold a fighting line, and a no less difficult one across which to maintain communications. In the summer of 1918, our line ran along the river valley, and the troops in this sector suffered much from diseases. East of this strong natural boundary, formed by the deep trough of the Jordan, we find a very different country. It rises abruptly from the Jordan Valley, and is in itself a plateau. It is at first fertile, but at distances ranging from 40 to 60 miles inland, it merges into steppe and then into sheer desert. Thus it is a country apart, difficult of access from Jerusalem and western Palestine, more easy of access from Damascus or from Arabia. Through it, from north to south, runs the HEJAZ railway, on its way from Damascus to Medina, and so it proved an area in which the Turks, based on Damascus, and the Arabs, operating from HEJAZ, were at greater advantage than our columns based on Jerusalem. We have now glanced at those portions of Palestine in which took place the principal fighting in this campaign. Our review would still be incomplete if we omitted all reference to the plain of Esdraelon. Starting from the sea coast immediately north of Cape Carmel, at the ports of Haifa and Acre, this plain runs east-southeast across the country to the Jordan Valley. Rising slightly at first, it forms the watershed of that ancient river, the River Kishon. After the watershed is crossed, there is a drop towards the Jordan Valley. This latter portion of the plain constitutes the Vale of Jezreel. This plain of Esdraelon is Armageddon. Here Barak overthrew Sisera, Gideon defeated the Midianites, and Saul and Jonathan met disaster and death at the hands of the Philistines. Here Josiah was defeated and slain by Pharaoh Necho. Near here, the Christians were defeated and their kingdom overthrown by the Saracens. On this plain Napoleon won his final and crushing victory over the Turks. No battle beyond a few cavalry engagements took place here during the campaign which we are to consider. The Turks had been totally defeated before ever this line was reached. But this plain has still for us a military interest. It may well be that here, where the mountains of Samaria overlook and command all approaches from the north, is to be found the best strategic line for the defense of the Suez Canal. In a country like Palestine, where levels and characteristics are so divergent, diversities of climate are to be expected. We have seen that the summer climate of the lower Jordan Valley is pestilential. Parts of the coastal plain also are very malarious, particularly from north of Jaffa to Mount Carmel. With these exceptions, the climate is by no means unpleasant, nor unsuitable for the conduct of military operations. Far enough south to enjoy plenty of bright sunshine, it is still some distance north of the tropics. Pleasant and regular breezes from the sea mitigate the discomfort which might otherwise prevail in a country almost surrounded by desert. The whole of the rainfall comes in the winter months. From about April to October, though dews are heavy, rain is unknown. But in the winter months, especially December and January, and to some extent February, the rainfall is intense, and the country on the plains and lower-lying districts is reduced to a sea of mud well-nigh impassable. Thus military operations in summer are liable to be prejudiced by a shortage of water, in winter by an excess. The ideal season for operations is therefore in the spring, when there is an abundance of water and a plentiful feed, and, next to this, the autumn, when the heat of the summer has passed its height, and the rains of winter have not yet made the country impassable. The importance of good railways in modern war is immense. We have already traced the construction of the broad gauge line from Egypt, which followed close behind the British in their advance across the desert and into southern Palestine. The Turks in western Palestine were at a perpetual disadvantage through the inferiority of the railway service. But in eastern Palestine, i.e. across the Jordan, the position was reversed. Before the war, Syria had been connected with Asia Minor by a broad gauge line from Aleppo to Riyadh, where it effected a junction with a narrow gauge line from Beirut to Damascus. The broad gauge line was part of the Baghdad railway scheme. But at this time, that railway, even between Constantinople and Aleppo, was only partially completed. The tunnelling of the Taurus Mountains was yet unfinished. Thus troops or supplies, coming from Constantinople to Damascus, had to break the journey at the Taurus Mountains and again at Riyadh. These two interruptions provided admirable opportunities for delay and confusion, which the dilatory Turk embraced. The tunnelling of the Taurus was pushed on with during the war, and in 1918 rumours reached us that these mountains had been pierced, so that trains could then run through from Constantinople, Haida Pasha, to Rayak. The installation of more businesslike Germans at the latter station went far towards minimising the delays and confusion due to the break of gauge. From Damascus, the HEJAZ railway, constructed nominally for Mecca pilgrims, runs due south, and passing along the high plateau of eastern Palestine, had already reached Medina. A branch from this line, starting from a junction at Deraa, ran westwards along the plain of Esdraelon to Haifa. Another line, almost parallel to the HEJAZ railway, ran from Damascus due south to Mezarib. This line was removed by the Turks after the commencement of the war, as the materials were required for railway construction elsewhere. Unconnected with any of these railways, a French line ran from Jaffa to Jerusalem. This also the Turks removed, as between Jaffa and Lud, while, for the remainder of its length, they altered the gauge so as to adapt it to the rolling stock of the HEJAZ railway. All these railways south of Damascus were narrow-gauge lines, without much rolling stock available, so that their carrying capacity was limited. On the outbreak of war, the Turks, acting under the guidance of the Germans, embarked upon a considerable program of railway construction. Starting from a point on the plain of Esdraelon, El Apeli, they constructed a new line which crossed the mountains about Samaria and reached the plain of Sharon at Tul Kerem. Thence it ran down the length of the coastal plain to Beersheba and, ultimately, to Auja in the desert. This railway was constructed in 1915 for the invasion of Egypt. Into this railway was incorporated portions of the old Jaffa-Jerusalem line, as between Lud and Junction Station. This was the none too distinctive name given to the important station which was constructed at the point where the older railway left the plain. This now became the junction for Jerusalem. At a later date, the Turks withdrew from Auja to Beersheba. The line south of the latter place was removed, and a new line was constructed from near Junction Station to points just north of Gaza. Roads in the coastal sector are good, though difficult for heavy motor traffic after rain. In the hills, the only first-class roads were the road running north and south along the ridge from Nablus through Jerusalem to Beersheba, and the road west and east from Jaffa to Jerusalem continued eastwards through Jericho and across the Jordan to Es-Salt and Ammon Station on the HEJAZ railway. The population of Palestine is very mixed, comprising Muslims, Christians, and Jews, with their various subdivisions and sects. The Muslim inhabitants, Arabs and Syrians, have little in common with the Turks except their religion. The Jews and the Christians groaned under Turkish oppression. Both Jews and Christians welcomed the advent of the British, while the Muslims accepted the situation, if not with pleasure, at least with equanimity. The Turks themselves form no part of the regular population. They are alien rulers, speaking a language unknown to the people, and incapable of understanding the language of the country. Although Palestine has been governed by Muslims for upwards of 1,000 years, it has only been annexed to the Ottoman Empire for 4 centuries. More than once during that period, it would have been torn away, but for the aid of the British. The government of Syria by the Ottoman Turk had been oppressive and corrupt, and marked by the discouragement of all progress and enterprise. It was high time that it should cease.
This concludes today's reading of With the British Army in the Holy Land, by H. O. Locke. Join us also tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.